You know what the best thing about me having no way that people can tithe it to me is? It means I can have a conversation with you about tithing and it be a completely unfiltered opinion. It means we can dive into what I actually think the Bible says about tithing because it's not me trying to get your money or me being like, oh, they may just think I'm after it and I have to be careful on it. No. So let's actually just dive straight into this. In the Bible, we've kind of got these three different sections. We've got the time before the law, the time between the law and when Jesus died on the cross, and then the time from after Jesus died on the cross to where we are now. People like to call this time after Jesus died on the cross as either the church age or the age of grace. And it is quite clear in a number of passages that we're not under law. So, in saying that, let's actually go back. Let's have a look at the example that Abraham gave, which is pre the law. Let's have a look at why tithes and offering were set up during the period of the law. And then we can kind of have a look at a couple of the passages in the New Testament to go, okay, if this is what it was all then, what is our obligation now? And is there even an obligation now? So the first part is we see this passage between Abraham and Melchizedek. It is the strangest passage in the Bible. Actually, not the strangest, there's quite a few strange ones, but it is 3 verses long. That is it. It is only 3 verses. And this is found in Genesis chapter 14, and it's verses 18 to 20. So what has just happened is Abraham has gone into the battle. And I believe this is the battle where his nephew Lot had been captured and he's gone there and he's brought them all back. And on his way back, he has this encounter with King Melchizedek, who is also the high priest of the God Most High. And in this encounter, Abraham gives Melchizedek a tenth. That's all those verses say, because straight after, and the reason why those verses can be so easy to miss is straight after we see that Abraham is having a conversation with the king of Sodom. And this is where Abraham turns around and says, I'm not taking any of the spoils of war. At least you turn around and try and say that you made me rich. So it's literally just before that. And then there's, I think, one other verse in about Psalms, which references Melchizedek. But other than that, the chapters that we see that explain what happened, that's in the book of Hebrews. And Hebrew devotes about 2 whole chapters to those 3 verses, to that encounter that Abraham had. And in Hebrews, as chapter 7, the first part of the explanation, the writer goes on to explain how Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek, and that Melchizedek was a high priest. He was a king as well as the high priest, and Jesus is our high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the whole priesthood of Melchizedek is a greater priesthood than the Levitical priesthood. And even in that, because the Levites were in Abraham's loins, they, in a sense, actually gave a tenth of a tithe to Melchizedek as well. So it's this whole beautiful picture around how Melchizedek being a greater high priest, so Jesus is a high priest in that under the order of Melchizedek. And it's just, I love it. I think it is an absolute beautiful picture. Okay, placeholder on that. We'll come back to that in the conclusion. Now, let's have a look at the Levitical priesthood and what the whole purpose of tithing was at that point in time. Now, I'm only going to touch on it because I love the book of Leviticus. I think it is absolutely fascinating. Reading through it can be quite dry, but when you listen to somebody who loves it, which I did years ago, and they explain all the different elements of it, it is just such a rich book, just full of so much symbolism, so much beauty, so much order, and it just shows us so much of God's character. So, in the book of under the Levitical priesthood, what happened? Now, we've got to actually go back to Passover. The last night that the Israelites are in Egypt, we have that whole Passover that happened where, the angel of death came in, and any of the doorposts that didn't have the lamb's blood placed on the places that were told to put it, then if they didn't have that, the angel went in and the firstborn was killed. Then we see, as Jesus is giving Moses all the law, he turns around and says, because I didn't kill one of your firstborns of the entire tribe of Israel, I am taking the entire tribe of Levi for myself. They are to be the priests. They are to be, I am their allotment. It's me. So with that, they weren't given an inheritance into the land of Israel. Their location of where they lived was around the tabernacle. Every other tribe were given allotments and places sections of land that was going to be their land. Now, with that, the way that they end up, God provided for the Levites, because he says he is their allotment, he sets up this whole system where the entire nation of Israel, all the other tribes, are to actually give a tenth of their product to give from their first fruits to the temple, to the tabernacle. And the Levites were actually allowed to consume it, that this was their food, this was their inheritance. And it's just this really beautiful picture of how God goes, well, I'm taking you to serve before me, but I'm going to make sure that you have everything that you need in the manner that the rest of Israel are going to support you. Now, the reason why I'm glossing over this is because there is so much more in regards to the tithes, the offering, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings. I think there's a few others. The first fruits. There's a whole pile of it, but we get the idea of the tenth because they were to give a tenth of their first fruits. Now, the offering being the first fruits, this idea comes from Deuteronomy chapter 26. And then also, if you have a look in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30, there's the idea of it around there as well. And then also, I've got a note here of Numbers 18, verses 8 and 9. So that's talking about the grain offering, the sin offering, and, Jesus being the inheritance for the family of Aaron, and then them having no inheritance. So that's the line of Aaron. And then down in verse 24, it talks about for Levi. That's why that's important. Now we jump into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it is really clear that Jesus said he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And then we get over into other books and it talks about how we are no longer under the law, and if we were to try and stay under the law, it would be a curse to us. So all these rules of it having to be under the law of giving a tenth, we're no longer under them. So what does that mean for us? Well, another verse that I want us to have a look at, now this is Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. And I'm going to turn there. It is just a beautiful beautiful verse. Whenever God turns around and says, test me and see if I'm going to do this, I just find it fascinating that he actually asks us to test him. Some have Malachi being the last book of the Old Testament. I find it hard to find. There we go. So Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. And he turns around and says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and test me now to this, says the Lord, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. So here we see God saying, hey, if you bring your tithe, test me. See what I'm going to do. See that as you bring it, I'm going to bless you abundantly. Your storehouses will be full. Now, the New Testament. So for the New Testament, the main sections that we see for this, so this is 2 Corinthians and it's chapters 8 and 9. So with this, in this section, Paul is telling them to give genu. Do you ever have those things where all of a sudden you get tongue-tied and you actually physically can't say a word? Well, that's happening to me right now on the word generosity is the other adjective of it. So to be generous. There we go. Finally got there. Okay. So in this passage, Paul is telling them to give generously. And in that, he's turning around and saying that each person is to purpose in their own heart what they're going to give. And the reason why I want to go to the Malachi passage before coming to this 2 Corinthians passage, so that Malachi passage, that was God talking to the Jews in regards to the Levitical law of giving the 10th of a tithe, as well as all the different offerings, which I haven't covered at all. And he turns around and says, hey, test and say that I'll fill the storehouses. So that's that promise in that context. Now we see over in 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, Paul gives an example of these people that had been generous and he is surprised at just the overflowing of blessings that God has poured back to them. So what that tells me is that this principle in Malachi is still a principle of God. It's still a principle of the law of the land and that God has put into place. So it's still applicable for us today. But giving a 10th under the law, not quite so much because we're not under law. But we are called to give what we've purposed in our hearts. We are told to make the decision. And we love this verse, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, where it says, each one must do as he is purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And there's other contexts around here that, Jesus gave his life for us. So under the New Testament, the standards are we're to give everything to God. It's not that we're giving back for salvation. It's he did the work on the cross and we trust him, and that's a free gift. We accept that freely. Then after we've accepted it freely and we're having that relationship with him, in that relationship, we often just get so in awe and so amazed by how much God has given us that we're compelled to give it all back to him. And this is where I like to think of it as that we're caretakers of the items. And being a caretaker means you're allowed to use it for enjoyment. There are so many passages in the Bible where God gives his children stuff for enjoyment. There is nothing wrong with that. And I like to think that the principle in the Old Testament, the Levitical law of giving a tenth of the first fruits, the idea of that is to show all of this came from God. So we're remembering that the blessings, the ability to earn the money, the ability to be able to do the work, to have what we need, that blessing comes from God. So we remind ourselves of that by giving of the first back to Him, trusting that He is going to sustain us with the remaining, that it's going to be enough to see through. And this is why I wanted to kind of link in with the Abraham of he gave a tenth before the law. So that kind of shows that the principle of giving a tenth isn't a law. It's, yes, it's the Levitical law, but it's also outside of it. So there is nothing wrong with choosing. I'm also going to remain with giving a tenth because that gives me a solid number in my mind that I'm going to keep with. But under, as you can see in 2 Corinthians, it's what you've purposed in your heart. So if you've purposed in your heart to be a tenth, then great. I know for myself, that's what I purposed in my heart. And also, there's always arguments about whether it's meant to be before tax or after tax. Yet again, that's about the law. So I know for myself, I purposed in my heart 10% after tax because I don't see the tax portion. That got taken out beforehand. So it was about what I saw come into my bank account. The rest of it wasn't even in my head that that was part of my income because that had already gone. So I see more that tithing nowadays to be more in line with like Abraham giving to Melchizedek, which was a representation of Jesus. So then that comes to the question of, well, does that mean you have to tithe to your local church or can you tithe elsewhere? Answer that, 2 Corinthians, what you've purposed in your heart. I think it's good to keep in mind the principle of the Levitical law, which was that the whole reason why the Israelites gave a tithe to the temple was to sustain the Levites. So I think that principle is quite good in that giving a tithe to your local church, your local fellowship, also helps sustain your pastor, who, looking at other passages that Paul says, they're worthy of their wage. They're due to, it's okay for them to earn an income for being the pastor and overseeing and doing all that work to oversee the running of the church. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So I think that's quite okay I think it's worth being mindful of that aspect, that if you choose not to give to your local church, yet again, that is between you and God. That's if that's what you've purposed in your heart, because it's about being a cheerful giver. In these 2 Corinthians passage, it also says, those who sow sparingly reap sparingly. Those who sow in abundance reap in abundance. So there is this principle in the Bible that the more you give, the more that comes back. But I don't like it when people teach it from the perspective of, oh, God gives back 100-fold. So if you give $1, you're going to get $100 back. I don't see that that's the principle of this passages. What I see the principle is that God blesses abundantly in His timing. So if you've always been faithful giving a tithe, He has promised that your storehouses will be full. And I know for myself, that's what I've experienced no matter what has happened. Even when my injuries increased to a point that I was no longer able to work full time for that season, still kind of coming out of that season and in the full recovery, God has been there to sustain me the whole way through. And it's been okay. Has there been the spare amount to, go do whatever my heart may desire? No. Is there the whole wisdom of living by a budget? Yes. But can I, even with that, turn around and say, God has always been faithful and always come through and always provided and given everything I need? And He's just been amazing. 100% yes, I can say that. It is to the point that now whenever I face something of going, I don't know how it's going to work. I was just like, I might not know how it's going to work, but I know it will. It might not be the outcome I want, but I know it's going to be the outcome I need, because God has proven that to me in my life time and time and time again. He said in that verse in Malachi to test him. Well, I did. I did. And I found that what he said was true. So this is my sort of entire thoughts on tithing. And I hope that kind of clears up some of the different ideas that you may have heard and kind of puts into perspective the different passages as to where they kind of actually sit in the whole scheme of things. As I said, my thoughts are, I think the 10% is a very good principle. It was good enough for Abraham, who is the man of faith, to do it. I think it's great. But remember, we're under the 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 principle of purpose in your heart. And trust that God's going to sustain you and provide for you and come through. Doesn't mean I'm telling you to give out of debt. No. No. Because there's other principles in Proverbs which turns around and says that that the borrower is slave to the lender. So it's not to give to the point that you're in debt. That is not God's principle or God's mannerism or God's way at all. We are called to be wise. It's about giving what has been purposed in your heart.